Ready, ready. Okay, good afternoon guys. So, mamimili tayo kasi na mauuna ngayon. Siyempre para may pakabayuan. Ako may kasalanan kung kanino mapupunta tong number. Okay, okay, reiterate ko lang sinong group 1. Ang group 1 ay yung leader ay si Mabanta. Group 2 si Dairit. Group 3 Daguman. Group 4 Razon. And Group 5 Castro. Naka-raise hand ka, Phoebe?
My group wants to go first daw.
Na?
My group wants to go first daw.
First, okay. Gusto ko random, sorry.
Ay, okay.
Okay. Para may gulat factor. Ready, ready, ready. Ha! Okay, ang una ay Group 3. Okay, ang group nila Dagungan. Okay, sila ang una. And then, let's go. Another one. Ang hina. Group 5. And then, Group 3, Group 5. Group 3 ulit, charot. ayaw na. Group 3 talaga yung ano. Ayan, Group 2. 3, 5, 2, then 3, 5, 2, and then, okay. 3, 5, 3, 5, 2, 4, 1. Okay? 3, 5, 2, 4, 1. 3, 5, 2, 4, 1. Okay. Sige. Wait lang. Allow ko pa yung mag-share screen. Okay. Sige. Group 3. Mark, sinong mag-present sa inyo?
Hello po Sir, bale ako po, tsaka po si Bea. Kami po yung magre-report and may separate po mag-share screen.
Okay. Okay. Okay, sige. Share screen ka na, kung sino na. Okay.
So we ask, okay na po Sir.
Okay, go.
Okay po. Okay, 1, 2, 3. So we ask ourselves, are media outlets biased? If so, how do we know if these media outlets are indeed telling the truth? So good afternoon everyone, we are Group 3, Daguman, Lumanog, Martin, Padregone, and Truya. In that sense, we would like to make our stand, wherein media outlets are biased, but the majority of them are still truthful. So let's go into that context. Next slide, please. First, we need to know the realistic view on media outlets and bias. So media outlets actually cater to different audiences, wherein there is a presence in the different phrasing, wherein the truths are not absent, but they are framed towards a certain perspective set by media outlets. This is present when we see reporters, journalists, and other broadcasters or other people in media as the primary carriers of bias. So in that sense, paano nga ba natin matutukoy that these people in media are biased? So when they voice out the news that they are reporting, they have a tendency to deliver bias with their opinionated mechanisms. Moving on to the next one. So aside from people in media, there are actually other factors for bias. One of which is media outlets as businesses. So as businesses, they tend to have bias towards the people that they favor and towards the increase of profits. We can see this in the form of sensationalism, wherein there is an exaggeration of the truth value of the news for more viewership and for the increase of public attention. Another perspective is the existence for the protection of allies. wherein there is a conflict of interest between the media outlets reporting and those who are being reported. So we can see this kind of protection of allies in the example in the screen. So Joseph Morong published a report on GMA program Saksi about the timeline of the Philippine pandemic response. So if you actually watch the report, we can say on a personal perspective, even from the perspective of others, that the report is actually detailed. It begins from the start or the onset of the pandemic in January 2020 up until the current trend that we can see in the end of 2020. So GMA, from their program Saksi, they withdrawn the said report and they released a statement saying that they noted deficiencies of the report in terms of fairness and balance. But we can see from this one that they did not specify what type of deficiencies are there in the report. So makikita natin na meron talagang conflict of interest between GMA News and versus the group of people being reported, which is in this context is the Philippine government. So for a more accurate presentation, let's now go on to the comparison of news articles to be started by Bea.
So now let's us compare the news articles from different political events and from different media outlets such as the Rappler, GMA, ABS-CBN, CNN, and Newstar, and the use of criteria in assessing if there is bias or not in the chosen articles. So for the news one, the topic is all about Duterte imprison those who refuse vaccination. As we can see in this slide, the GMA News Online and the ABS News showed fair or unbiased headlines. So for the headline of GMA, it highlights the main idea of the news article, while sa ABS-CBN, the journalist was able to convey the article information in a short and concise manner, meaning yung headline na mismo yung nagiging gist or yung nagiging mismong topic ng article nila. For the other media outlets, such as the CNN, Philstar, and Rappler, makikita na gumamit sila ng word na threaten, which is a form of sensationalism which they use as a scare tactic sa mga audience or readers nila. And these scare tactics ay nagpapalabas ng natural emotions, natural fear ng mga audiences which makes them convinced para basahin yung buong article. So, moving on, for the news 2, the topic is all about the fighting of COC by former Senator Bongbong Marcos. So for this article written by ABS-CBN, they use slant, wherein they focus on presenting information against Bongbong Marcos, which includes yung dictatorship nung Marcos martial law and the ill-gotten wealth nga nung pamilya ni Marcos. Though ABS-CBN presented both sides of the opposition and the BBM, still relevant pa rin sa article yung information against Bongbong Marcos. In another media outlet, Rappler, we can see na sa article nila, next slide please. We can see sa article nila that they uses the sensationalism and slant. Sa sensationalism, the use of inflammatory language, wherein they said yung Bongbong Marcos almost won the vice presidential seat in 2016 in a bitterly contested race. So, this line ay pumupukaw or parang nagkukuha ng interest ng mga audience about dun sa topic nga. And then they also uses slant wherein yung mga information nila ay nagko-contest against BBM. And yung information na sinulat nila ay hindi lang tungkol kay BBM but it proceeds dun sa anti-Marcos sentiments like sa dictatorship and the ill-gotten wealth nga ng pamilya nila. Another is that the article written by GMA News, which does not present any distinct bias. Clearly, present lang nila na that Bongbong Marcos filed the COC. On the other hand, CNN naman ay nagpakita ng bias by omission wherein they only reported Marcos' avoidance of questions regarding his father and mother and did not include BBM's platforms that he mentioned during his COC filing. Lastly, sa Philstar naman, just like the other articles from other media outlets, they use a slant which focused on information against BBM and did not present any BBM's response to the criticism against him. For the News 3, this will be discussed by Mark.
Okay, so for the third news, this is where Duterte signs the Universal Healthcare Bill into law. So for the article published by the ABS-CBN, we can see that there is bias by omission, wherein they left out relevant information. In this sense, ABS-CBN story lacks information about the law itself. So moving on. If we try to see the article published by Rappler, in the next slide, we can see that there is a presence of spin, wherein in the last part of the article, the intentions of the authors of the bill, Ejercito and Roque, to run for senator, they were mentioned, even if this has nothing to do with the signing of the Universal Healthcare Law. Moving on. There is also a presence of sensationalism, whereas it is unnecessary to make a whole article focusing on who should be credited for the Universal Healthcare Law. Next, please. So, as you can see, GMA's article did not present any bias as compared to other news outlets. Next, please. Same with CNN, which is fairly objective. Next slide. So for Philstar naman, there is spin wherein the information is taken out of context, wherein Philstar focused on the remarks and thoughts of the president rather than the provisions and the contents of the law itself. So there is an existence of bias. Moving on. For the summary to be discussed by Bea.
So for the summary of tabulated facts, News 1 with the topic Duterte in prison those who refuse vaccination, ABS-CBN and GMA News did not show any bias, while Rappler, CNN and Philstar showed bias, which is sensationalism. For the News 2 with the topic Filing of COC by former Senator Bongbong Marcos, only GMA News did not show any bias, while ABS-CBN, Rappler, CNN and Philstar showed bias, which they use slant, sensationalism, and bias by omission. For the News 3 with the topic Duterte signs Universal Healthcare Bill into law, GMA News and CNN did not show any bias, while ABS-CBN, Rappler, and Philstar showed bias. Next.
It is important to consider that the truth and bias are two different things, and the truth value can be found in the common content among different news articles. When we search those common similarities between different news outlets, we can actually find the truth value for those information. Therefore, our stand remains that media outlets are biased, but the majority of them are still.
Sorry, nakamute ka. Napindot mo ata.
Ay,
For your last statement, sorry.
okay po. So before we conclude, so it's important to remember that the truth can still be found even if an article is biased, because the truth and bias are two different things. Therefore, our stand remains that media outlets are biased, but the majority of them are still truthful. That will be all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Clap naman tayo, guys. Clap emoji. Okay, good job, guys. So, ipunin muna natin yung joke. Sige, pwede pala tayo magtanong. Magtanong na tayo. Sino may tanong sa kanila? Raise hand kayo kung may tanong kayo. Okay, sige. Wala mo ng tanong. Proceed tayo sa next reporter. So, congratulations for the wonderful presentation. Group 3. Okay. Next is Group 5. Okay. Gab, sinong magre-report sa inyo?
Sir, I will be the one to report, and Janea will be the one to share her screen.
Okay.
Okay. Can I start na, sir?
Okay, sige, go.
Okay. So, good afternoon, everyone. So, our take for this activity is more on a generalized perspective with the media bias, whether it is biased or not. So, next slide, please, Janine. So, in totality, after collating our opinions with regarding the question, which was stated, are media outlets biased? We came to the conclusion that yes, they are indeed biased. We do agree with the stand of the first group that presented, and we agree with their objective presentation of the data. But next slide, please, Janea. But I think the thing is, when we also took into account our personal perspective of the media. If you're someone that's currently consuming media, whether on Facebook or different platforms via television, radio, or yun nga, social media, you would see that there is a stark difference between the information that's presented, right? That's why our members all felt somewhat similar to how we perceive bias to be. So the collective term that we have been using as a group is unconscious bias, because a lot of the time we are consuming the exact same media over and over again, and due to repetition and due to our familiarity with the media that we are constantly consuming, we unconsciously agree with all the things that they are presenting, and we are subject to this unconscious bias because we do not notice the nuances or the differences when it comes to other forms of media. So, next slide, please, Sinea. Our stand that really puts everything together is no one can truly be unbiased. So this goes into the fact that journalism as a whole is still an industry. So journalism is a profession that aims to provide news, provide data, to present it, whether written, spoken, or via audio or via audio visuals. And for any piece of news to air, for any piece of news to be showcased in whatever platform, it would undergo several filtration processes. It would undergo whether when we touch on to the business aspect of journalism, we have a board of directors for every journalistic business na nagde-decide kung ano yung ipuput out. And as someone, this is anecdotal evidence which you should take with a grain of salt. As someone who has been a student journalist for more than 8 years, and as someone who has worked with one of the most renowned journalists here in the Philippines, their training is always the way they train students is always to make it catchy, to make the news newsworthy. Because doon pa lang makikita mo na yung biasness or the media bias that is present with news. Because there is that omission, there is that delusion that occurs when something is deemed newsworthy. So yung mga simple things that are happening right now, when deemed unnewsworthy by the board, will not be featured. But the biasness can be obviously seen by kung paano nga pinapresent yung data, as stated by the group before us. There are certain media outlets that have a more, as the terminology used was sensationalism, right? Because there is that appeal to try and make it more newsworthy, to try and make it more attractive to a reader. That's why journalists undergo this entire process of trying to make that piece of news readable, because at the end of everything is still a business. And that's why we also have so many theories that are revolving around bias. We have confirmation bias, we have unconscious bias, and the main thing that is very much related with the topic that we have is media bias. So yun nga, media bias is very much controlled with the market of the media, right? We have the audience. So there is already bias whether this audience is going to be educated, whether this audience is going to be one of the lower median classes of society. So data is always created to data or news is always created to be readable to the specific audience that they're trying to present it to. So the same piece of information can be converted for a different type of audience, which again can plant unconscious biases with the use of different words, verbiage, and the tonality of the news in total. So next slide, please, Janelle. So everything can be biased unless it is a completely objective topic. So if we know this for a fact that during this political economy, or I mean this political minefield that we are experiencing right now, biases can be pretty much obvious with every single media outlet right now. So political stances are very much subjective. You cannot try to persuade or fully push a political stance to someone because again it is subject to their own belief, even if you provide objective data. But certain news like presentation of anything that relates with human rights, anything that relates with um, based from the Universal Code of Ethics, Universal Code of Morality, that is agreed upon by society as a whole, which makes it objective. Those types of news can be presented with little to no bias because, yun nga, it is not subjective in nature. Pero for the vast majority of things that are being presented by the media right now, which again is subjective in nature, biases will definitely transpire. And again, you need to remember, yung news na pinapresent nyo or yung news na kinoconsume nyo is created or is written by a writer. And that writer himself, herself, or themselves have personal biases that may affect how they curate the data, how they present the data, which data they will omit, and which verbiage or which words they will use. And even though this undergoes a strict filtration process through an editorial board, biases will still surface because of this. Next slide, please, Janelle. So this is something that this is just a collation of all different headlines and all different news articles that you can see that showcase biases from different outlets. And one specific thing that I can point you at is that di na namin nakuha yung original na post, but on the right side of this picture with Rappler, they actually presented a data regarding Cayetano, and it was the data they presented was actually false and very detrimental to the reputation of Cayetano, and they had to omit and provide an erratum for what they did. And this just goes to show that you need to hold media accountable as well for the data they are presenting, because they are in fact still capable of committing errors, presenting false data, which is why we are a big fan of the triangulation method in trying to distinguish whether a media is biased or not. So next slide, please, Tinem. So how do we actually know that these outlets are telling the truth or not? Because everyone has facts, right? Everyone has a set of facts that they are using in order to present data. And the credibility of the source can be determined via the triangulation method, which is basically using three different sources, three different outlets, and confirming whether all three sources collate or share the exact same data. And also, you can also fact check or background check the authors of the media that you are consuming. What are their field of expertise? What are the information that they are presenting themselves? Next slide, please. And it is a value of objectivity and subjectivity. But again, if it is opinionated, one-sided, it is biased. Because in journalism, there is not just two sides to a story. There are always multiple people involved in even just a single circumstance. Even if there are just two opposing parties, there are always multiple perspectives to a single circumstance, which is precisely why it is detrimental if we are only to follow one opinion or one side, or if we are only to cover one side. So if you are only hearing one side of the story from the outlet that you are reading, consider it biased, because it is not healthy to just present one side of the out. It's not ethical for the outlet to just present one slide. And last slide, please. So again, media is very much prominent with bias. So by asking questions, we can confirm if it's the truth. So this just brings in the aspect of us as individuals and our role in whether our personal role to confirm whether media is biased or not. This involves your duty as someone who is consuming the media outlets or consuming what the media presents, and fact checking everything yourself. If there is a lack of diversity, if the sources are not fit within the triangulation method, if there are standards that are being flipped from one side to another, or as we call them, double standards, and if there is a total lack of context when the media presents the data, then we can confirm whether or not media is biased. Again, the how we determine whether something is biased is still based on our personal bias, which is why uh, there is nothing truly unbiased in media. So that's why our group stands for, or our group states our conclusion as media is definitely biased. That is all. Thank you.
Galing, 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 galing. Okay, thank you, Gab. Thank you sa group ni Gab. Galing ng presentation. Daya, no? Mga ano kasi ito, mga com students kasi ito. Hindi, joke lang, joke lang. Again, lucky nga sila, di ba? Kasi naka-enroll sila sa STS ng mga freshie, no? Okay, pero yan. Sumakto lang yung topic na outlined for this semester for them. Okay, sige, thank you, thank you. May tanong ba kayo sa kanila? Okay, raise hand kung may tanong sa kanila. Ako may tanong ako pero mamaya ako itatanong yung mga tanong ko. So be ready pa rin mga nag-present na group, ha? Okay, so mamaya ako sa late tatanong. Okay, so kung wala na. Let's proceed to the next group. Thank you again, Group 5. Ang next na group ay Group 2. Ang group ni... Sino group to? Oh my God. Sino group to?
Direct po, sir.
Ayun, direct. Nawala sa tab
Share screen lang po ni Sam yung presentation.
Okay. Wait lang. Parang malinaw ba sa lahat or parang malabo? Ayan, luminaw siya. Nice. Okay. Sige, that's good. Ready? So,
Ready
start
na.
na kayo kung go na.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. So our group would like to present our stand regarding the bias in media outlets and how do we know what is truthful and what is not. So first, we must establish the important terms here in the presentation, which are media bias and media outlet. For media bias, it is the presence of bias among journalists and news producers in selecting stories as well as how they are covered. And additionally, you can also talk about the way that it is pushed, or the direction of which it is endorsing by being selective or being prejudiced when it comes to the reporting rather than being objective. which is what news should be. And then for the media outlet, it is any newspaper, magazine, radio, broadcast, cable, or satellite television that disseminates information through various channels. So if along the or as we go on through the presentation, please remember those keywords or key concepts. Next slide po. Are media outlets biased? So let's first address the first question for this presentation. So what causes media bias? So there are practical limitations when it comes to journalism and disseminating information. Because time is limited and not everything can be reported for the time frame given to reporters and news outlets, selectivity is in fact inevitable. So they must pick or filter out the information that they are reporting, and of course there will be a part of them, or there will be a standard for which they will be picking this information, which ultimately will affect how the news outlet or the media outlet is perceived. Next slide po. For the first source, we are examining a research from the University of San Juan in Cebu, the Philippines, and in which the inquiry, Philstar, Manila Bulletin, the Manila Times, and Journal Online all scored bias values equivalent to relatively considerable bias. So in this research, they examined the bias among newspapers, and there are in fact levels of bias, from allowable bias to bias or highly biased. Manila Times scored the highest, while Philstar scored the lowest. However, in their conclusion, they stated that Manila Times was then deemed only as biased with an accuracy rating of 89%. So they used a lexicon-based system in which they measured the consistency of bias to controversy. So although the topic was not mentioned, so please take this research as a grain of salt, there were a lot of recommendations regarding also examining the direction of bias, but the conclusion of the study was that Manila Times was biased because it scored the highest. Next slide po. For the source number 2, it is also a research regarding the perceived bias among news outlets regarding the Battle of Marawi news coverage from May to October of 2017. And the Manila Bulletin, once again, Philippine Daily Inquirer, and Philippine Star all showed anti-administration bias. And there were all of them were leaning more on the negative or the against the administration. And then if you so we included all our sources. So if you check the research, there were graphs to show that the graphs were all related, positive, neutral, and negative polarities. And there was even a conclusion that there was a collusion or a secret agreement among these news outlets because the results seem to be so close to each other or related to each other. Next slide po. For the source number 3, please take this again with a grain of salt, because this is on Quora, which is like a Reddit website. There are testimonies from random people. But there is one statement that definitely impacted our group, or there was a lot of commotion in our group about this. The least biased media outlet is the one that is most aligned with your beliefs. So if we are to examine that statement, it seems as though we can say that a media outlet is biased only if and only if it is not leaning towards our belief, or it is against who we are believing in or what we are believing in. And then some of the most believed objective media outlets are those that are not well known, like UNTV, Bloomberg Philippines, and CNN Philippines. And then there were also sentiments about GMA being too pro-administration, controlled, and protected by a higher authority. Next slide po. For the source number 4, this is more of an objective type of website. No media outlet, even an established one, is completely bias-free. So relating to the other slides, there are in fact levels of bias, and it just so happens that other media outlets have a higher level of bias compared to others. So their journalists and news reporters will be in fact picking and sorting out what information needs to be delivered, although some groups might argue otherwise or against them. Next slide po. So how do we know that these media outlets are telling the truth, and what ways can we improve on ourselves to know the truth? So for the source number 5, we have a research survey from Statistica or Statista with with participants of 2,029 participants in 2021 regarding the trust in news outlets in the Philippines. So GMA Network yield the highest trust rating with 74% and only 9% for distrust, while Rappler and Bulgar received the lowest trust rating, 45% and 40% for trust respectively. Next slide po. For source number 6, we have some sort of a recommendation on knowing and assessing our media outlets. So in this source, we have the concept of hostile media effect was mentioned. It is somewhat related to the previous concepts in the previous slides. It is about hostile media effect is about the way we see ourselves as part of a group and within our own identities. And that's why we examine this bias, because those information or those perspectives are in fact sensitive to us and important to us. So what can journalists do in order to avoid hostile media effect? They must report objectively. They must not put themselves into or they must not affect their emotions towards this reporting. They must take into consideration the audience's profile and perspective. They must consider the story's framing with extreme cautious. So they must observe where the information is leading or how the audience can in fact perceive this. And they must promote unified identity instead of factional. So there are different types of truth like subjective, objective, and complex truth. So for news, there must be an objective truth wherein it can be examined by physicality. So everyone is entitled to their own subjective truth, but the role of the news is to deliver the objective truth, which everyone can examine for its physicality and its validity. Next slide po. For source number 7, more additional recommendations. They must consider or check the credibility of the sources. They check the diversity of the workforce, and then the the article itself, if there are double standards examined, and of course the context or how it was reported and where it was reported. Next slide po. For our stance and our conclusions, are media outlets biased? There is no media outlet that is bias-free. Each outlet has its own degree of bias. Certain sides of news and stories are given more importance depending on the outlet and or the journalists. Thus, media outlets are biased. However, and it is a big however, this does not exempt them for being accountable for providing the objective truth and the objective information that we deserve. Are media outlets telling the truth, and how can we tell? A well-known media outlet does not automatically equate to it being absent of bias. For the audience and the receivers of the information, one must critically analyze and survey the sources, context, perspective, framing, and other factors of that particular media outlet and other media outlets as well in order to examine our own subjective truth, the objective truth of everyone, and of course how we can apply this to our everyday lives, which is the complex truth. That is all po for our presentation, Group 2 of STS. Thank you po.
Wow. Okay. Nice. Thank you, Renz, for that presentation. Okay, then. So, dami natin natutunan today. Okay, congrats. Okay, next will be... Ay, may joke lang. May tanong ba kayo? Siyempre, yung mga tanong niyo. Game, may tanong ba kayo? Mga students? Okay, kung wala, let's proceed. Okay, wag mo na kayo mag-leave ha, yung mga, kahit mga group leader. Kawawa naman group leader. Magtatanong pa ako, okay. Pero not necessarily group leader sasagot mamaya. Ha? Kung gusto niyo yung groupmate niyo sumagot kasi mas magaling siya dun. Okay, game lang. Okay, let's go for group number 4. Ito si Razon ba? Tama ba? Sino magpe-present sa inyo?
Hello po. Ako po magpe-present po for our group today.
Okay. Sige. Okay, ready? Okay, go.
So last week, we were given 2 questions about media biases, and today we are going to talk about that in the short period that we are given. So, next slide po. So for our course outline, we have key definitions, Philippine media outlets, evidences of media biases, and tips on how to identify bias and credible information. So next slide po. So what is media and media bias? Next slide. So media refers to the communication channels through which we disseminate news, music, and movies, and other forms of information in a larger mass. It includes physical and online newspapers, magazines, television, and radio. So when we talk about this is where we gather publicly or privately information, and this is the most used to get a form of expressing objective articles and truth. So media bias naman occurs when journalists or news organizations allow their own opinions to affect the news that they should be reporting objectively. So next slide po. So on the screen are different media outlets that we have in the Philippines. So like the ABS-CBN News, GMA News, newspaper publishings like the Manila Times, the Philippine Star. So these are some of the most known media outlets that we have currently in the Philippines. Next slide po. So the first question is, are media outlets biased? So to answer that question, our group has, through research and discussion, has decided that yes, media outlets are biased. So here are our evidences of why media outlets are biased. Next po. So first is po, journalism becoming news personalities. So in a current trend po, we can see that various journalists or even news reporters, anchors that should be reporting our news in TV shows, radio shows, writing news articles in newspapers are turning to media to influence their own opinion. Mostly, we see this in Facebook outlets, Twitters, and other forms of social media. So next slide po. So one other evidence po how media is biased, media ownership in media outlets. So if we know, our media outlets are not just free. They don't provide free news. They are paid and they are systematically done to give out information. So may mga times na pwede na dahil sa corporation nila gusto nilang pakita tong news na to, ito yung ipaprioritize nila. That is some sort of form of censorship. Censorship is just a violation of what we should have in garnering news from these media outlets. So some examples of media ownership are corporate owned media where it is just their own corporation. They fund their own media outlets. State-owned media naman, makikita doon is these media ownerships can be maapektuhan dahil yung ibang mga political people ay nagtuturn into news so that most of their political beliefs or yung stand nila is yung nakakaangat. So next po. So if you heard the last reporter from Renz, it is also stated in the table here how there are levels nga ng biases. So first level is allowable bias hanggang sa level 4, which is extremely biased. So in the table, we see that in the bias values of inquirer, they are 0.16, which is middle. So they are relatively biased, pero hindi sila biased na evident na talaga sa makikita mo in times of in their own articles. So in this table also, you can also see that Manila Times has the highest, almost 2.2, which is level 3, which is considered biased. So this was garnered through Lexica. Ito yung type ng technology kung saan pinifilter out nila yung mga different kinds of words that can be considered positive or negative. Then they filter through a system and goes through to form these bias values. So these are the total based from that Lexica na program. So next slide po. So here we have naman po examples of media biases. Next. So media bias in politics. So if you can see the picture here, there are two quotes about President Duterte during his campaign. So in ABS-CBN News, they misquoted what he said during the debate. At this is just a blatant form of bias because napapasama yung tingin ng isang political figure just because of this one statement na binigay ng isang news outlet. So makikita mo, kakaiba, negative yung pagkakasulat ng ABS-CBN instead of how CNN Philippines wrote it as just President Duterte proclaiming that this should be ours. So yes. Next po. So Luzon bias media. Kung alam natin po lahat, most media outlets are based in Luzon. So this is one factor po kung bakit bias po ang news, ang mga media outlets sa Luzon. Kung makikita nyo dito, Bagyong Sendong flooded or affected Mindanao the most. But sa news, hindi mo makikita na Mindanao yung nakafocus. So in result of that, may mga researchers na nagsasabi na dahil na po dun sa obvious Luzon bias, yung mga donations na dapat mapunta sa mga Mindanao ay mas nagpo-focus sa Luzon kasi ito yung mga fino-focus na information ng mga media. Okay, next po. So, since nakita na natin yung mga types of biases sa ating media, these are tips to identify bias and credible information. In detecting bias, you should always check the author first kasi these authors reflect what they write. Even though they try to objectively write news articles to provide to the public, they will always be biased in their beliefs, in how they were raised, and how they learned during growing. There will always be bias based on their backgrounds. So what is the author's political view? What does the author stand to gain in writing that publication or news article? Does the author present alternate points of view? Do they just pinapakita lang ba nila yung negative side na itong political figure nito, or just stating the facts but some of them are still aligned in what they believe and what they are standing for? So next slide. detecting fake news. So fake news is evident around the internet. So kung sino-sino lang pwedeng mag-post sa internet and some people just believe it. So to avoid that, determine whether other outlets are reporting the same news. So wag kang mag-trust sa isang source lang. That's just bad news. Uh, Relying on one source is not a good sign and not something we should be something not responsible as active participant of uh, bettering the country. So be leery of sensational headlines because this can be clickbaits. So overall, in this slide po, you should always research what you see in certain articles, news. Don't just trust one. Always check the sources, check everything, and cross-reference it instead of just relying on one source that you found in Google searching and the first page. Yun yung makikita mo. Next. Okay. So for our last po, biases for the invisible lens through which we all subconsciously see the world. Accepting your own biases as well as others involves understanding that bias is natural, inevitable part of human cognition, not unique to you, your company, or your employees. So bias is inevitable, hindi yung matatanggi sa humankind. So any form of publication na masusulat, masasabi natin, masasend out through these media outlets are always biased po. So ito po yung mga sources namin ito po yung group. And the next slide po, just our sources po. So you can check it out po if you like to. So that's all po. Thank you po.
Okay. Thank you. Ganda ng mga slides yung galing. Okay. Nag-raise hand si Ward, ha? Yes? Ay, napindot nila nga ata. Okay. So thank you, group 4. Okay. So may tanong ba tayo, mga students, mga classmates? Okay. May mga katanungan ba? Alright. Parang wala, no? Okay. So mamaya may tanong ako. Tapos, for the last group 1, sila Phoebe. Galing nga naman. Sila yung gustong mauna, tapos by fate, they have been placed last. Okay, sino mag-represent? Sorry?
All of us po.
All of us. Okay, sige. Okay. Okay, sige, you can start now if you're ready.
Good afternoon. Our group will be presenting an exploration of the conventions of media bias and present evidence reasoning our group's stand to believe that media biases have surfaced in leading Philippine media outlets today.
Okay, so before we discuss anything else, let's quickly go over the different types of media bias in order to fully understand what we're dealing with. There are various types, but we classified them into 6. The first is placement, where they use visuals to highlight their chosen story. The second is story selection, where they handpick narratives to support their agenda. Omission is purposely leaving out the undesirable bits. Source selection is kind of similar to this by leaving out the sources that disagree with their claims. Labeling is using certain types of wording in order to drive the audience into a chosen narrative. And lastly, the spin, which is when they take a fact out of context. So let's also quickly go over the history of media bias, starting with the Spanish occupation. Next slide, please. So this is where the media supplied by Spain was heavily catered to the Spanish elite. So in response to this, the Filipinos created our own newspaper in order to spread information on what was actually happening to our country. Next, we move on to the Marcos era. Next slide, please. So this was the most controlled the media has ever been. This is because Marcos issued a declaration that the military take over all media outlets in order to filter them and control the content that they put out. So with that being said, rather, here are some present day examples of media bias. Next slide, please. So you can see here, the first is clearly an example of sensationalism. This was during a time where Laila was under a lot of scrutiny and the media also took a jab at her. So the next example, we have a spin. So I think we're all kind of familiar with this. This is the Dengvaksha controversy. This was completely blown out of proportion by the media and also the internet, which ultimately caused vaccine hesitancy. And then the last example we have is a slant. So in this article, it's seen that it's dedicated, like the entire article is dedicated to showing the Tete's bad side. So it shows the overimposition of the negative and the suppression of other aspects of Duterte. So for our next portion, we will have Jalea with new forms of media bias.
In modern-day media, the goal is often to pacify the public to avoid unnecessary panic and make no enemy. Hence, the media constantly tries to distribute information in a balance of partition. Unfortunately, however, it is not uncommon that in their attempt to be strongly biased, many media outlets have unwittingly become biased in their presentation of information, and this can occur in two ways. First, we have the outdated binomial partition. In an attempt to remain central, the media will split opinions of the public and build on the idea of two sides to the controversy, which segregates information into either side, essentially leaving out the possibility of outliers and or mixed perceptions. And it also often leads to the exaggeration and glamorization of the sides of the story. So one of the notable examples of this in the Philippine media is narrowing the subject of news articles on Bongbong Marcos and Leni Robredo, leaving out other presidential candidates like Lodi de Guzman in the shadows. Now, secondly, we have normalizing chaos or normalcy bias. And this kind of bias focuses on nonverbal cues, how a story is framed and delivered. And in an attempt to pacify the public, the media will often present chaotic and disturbing matters in a normal manner, essentially downplaying the severity and relevance of such events. And this is dangerous because the audience is resultantly prevented from feeling full emotions on the matter, and demand for action or necessary change is delayed. For the next part, we have Phoebe again on why media bias happens.
Okay, so why media bias happens? Well, I'm sure we're all wondering. So the biggest reason is for profit. Let's not forget that people love money and will not monopolize anything that they can get their hands on. For the next reason, we have a more algorithm-based. So there's something we call filter bubbles and echo chambers. Filter bubbles come from the algorithm recognizing what we like to consume. So for example, if you look at shoes on Shopee for about 30 minutes, we'll see that ad on YouTube. And then now we have echo chambers. So these come from filter bubbles, or they can be formed because of something else, but it's when we're overexposed to that content that we like so much that we don't see anything else, and thus our perception of reality is distorted. Next, we have Jalea again with how we know what's true.
Okay, so as proven by the previous groups, in the media, the truth is not always absent. And as mentioned in the types of media bias, sometimes the truth is skewed to a certain extent that it's far from the factual context. So in that sense, news outlets do report the truth based on facts of recent events, but then these truths are susceptible to manipulation. Hence, to determine the existence of media bias, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting Incorporated, or FAIR, a national media watch group based in New York, published an article which tackles how to evaluate the presence of media bias through asking the questions flashed on the screen. Now, the answers to these questions lead to whether the truth they are presenting encapsulates a factual event and information or serves their interest by fitting into the narrative that they wish to push. And a friendly reminder lang, now when it comes to digesting the information that the media feeds us, it is also our responsibility to think critically and filter warped information. Moving on, we have Lyra for the implications of media bias.
The flow of media information involves four components, and according to Anderson and McLaren in their 2012 study, media owners have political as well as profit motives. Because of these, they become a very important and harmful asset to stakeholders in extending their cost to the consumers. These implications include short-term effects that were classified in three: information, value, and engagement. Information is what we get from a news story, which could include either ideological bias or bias that yearns to further a stakeholder's image, or it could be damaging bias that misrepresents facts. Headlines play a crucial part in catching the attention of readers and swaying them. And of course, the media has eventually learned to overuse this whole headline fiasco. Moreover, though the actual content needs no complicated interpretation, the way it's written makes it susceptible to misleading information, confusion, and bias. Lastly, engagement. Engagement is affected by two factors: our inherent bias, which may dictate what media outlets we visit for info, and our personal viewpoints, which we share and sometimes use to criticize obvious biases that we see. Moving on to the long-term effects of media bias would include those that succeed content engagement in which the consumers tip the scales of how a person or a situation is perceived by the society. Media trust refers to implications on the part of the consumers. Too much focus on political and profit motives leads to news stories that tend to not stray away from the mainstream. In this sense, interpretation of reality becomes deceptive. Media bias can also evoke misinformation, misrepresentation, and suppression of facts, which are all stimulators of consumer distrust. Meanwhile, some benefits can also be derived, like the development of consumers' critical thinking and analysis of what they read. Finally, the political stand of the people refers to the implications on the part of the stakeholders. Media bias may benefit certain politicians or associates by furthering their advocacy campaigns. However, if not too careful, it can also be the cause of their downfall, even just because of a single article. Media outlets also have the means to sway the votes of the mass. They are inevitably full of biases, especially with regard to political dialogues. Thus, it is substantial that as consumers, we take in a broad range of articles for political content, not only to protect stakeholders that are deserving of our trust, but also because we consumers also hold as much power as the media, and we dictate the change far more than what we read. For the conclusion, we believe that media bias is present in every media outlet existing in a country, no matter how subtle it can be, what type it is, and whom it benefits or harms. With every bit of information getting more attainable than ever with just a click on a phone or a simple press on a TV remote button, myriad of news are being fed to the public. Threads of stories and truth that can be spun and weaved to fit into a particular agenda by an organization, government, or even the public itself. You may probably wonder, how can we tell if the news is true or not when it is somehow biased? Well, journalists have argued that 100% objectivity is impossible, so there will always be evidence of minimal bias in an article. However, according to Aliprandini and Flynn in 2018, it is also the aim and job of every journalist to limit these biases or present them in a balanced manner. It may be true that an article shows biases. Nevertheless, truth will never be absent in the news, like what Jalea said earlier. For truth telling will always be the first obligation in journalism. And knowing the truth of an event is a two-way process. It is a collective effort of both the media and us, the public. If truth telling is the obligation of journalism, cross-checking and verifying the details from different sources and articles are ours. It is up to us if we would feed on or vomit these meals of information. And it is also up to us on how we utilize them. That's all. Thank you.
Wow, very good, very good. Ang galing, nahihiningal ako kay Julia. Okay, galing, galing, galing. Oo nga, pero ang bilis nga, no? Parang ano, ang dami nila kasing ano, ang dami nila information to give us. Okay, very good, group 1. Yung timer kasi. Okay, kaya yung ano, kaya tayo may timer para malimit yung mga bagay. Okay? So, kasi lalagpas tayo ng 4 pag nag-free ako ng time. Good thing pasok naman kayo sa time limit. Okay, may tanong ba sa group 1? Group 1 usually, diba? Tama. Okay, group 1, may tanong ba kayo sa kanila? Okay, wala kayong tanong. Okay, sige. Ako yung magtatanong. Sa group 3, tanong ko sa group 3, what's fair or anong definition nyo ng fair at unfair? Meron kasi sa slides yun na, sige, patingin ng slide, sorry. Sa mga una yun. Kahit ganyan na lang, kahit wag nyo na i-present, okay lang. para mas mabilis yung transition. Sige, baba mo pa. Yung sa mga example na yun. Sige pa, go pa. Ayan. What is fair? What is not fair? Fairly biased. Marami pang ibang example sa next slides niya, pero yan. Yun yung isang, yun yung isang tinatanong ko. Meron kasing words na fair and unfair. So ano yung definition yun ng fair at unfair?
Sir, siguro po I'll try to answer in behalf of our group. In terms of fair and unfair, it can be categorized in terms of the level of bias of a media outlet. So masasabi po natin na fair yung bias kahit na bias yung media outlet kapag nandun pa rin po yung majority ng truth value na dapat nilang nire-report. So whether they have a component of media bias, sensationalism, omission, as long as nandun pa rin po yung gist or sabihin nating majority of the truth value ng information, that can be seen, sir, as fair as compared to unfair kapag nag-stray away na po in opposition to the truth value yung pinoportray ng media outlet.
Sige nga, baba mo pa yung slides. Ngayon na ba yung huli? Ay, okay na pala yun. Sige, taas mo pala, sorry. Oops. Okay. Sige, taas mo. Yan. Sorry. Ayan pala, yung fair and slash unbiased. Second slide pala yun. Ayan. Ayan yung ano ko, yung concern ko. So yung fairness dyan ay based lang sa headline.
Yes po, sir, valid dun po kasi sa examples po namin. We have 3 news examples. Yung first example po namin focuses on the bias based on the headlines. Second po yung articles. Third example, both the headline and the article po.
Okay, in that example, sa slide na yun, how did you say na fair siya? Paano siya magiging, sige, kung di mo masagot yun by a formal definition, bigay ka ng example on how to make this unfair. How to make these headlines unfair.
Hi, sir. I just wanna, pwede po pa next slide. Actually, we presented different, po, sir, media outlets. So yun, as you can see, the other media outlets, CNN, Philstar, and Rappler, they use, this is these are their headlines. Duterte threatens to arrest Filipino who refuse to get vaccinated. And yun yung similarity sa kanila. They were the word threaten. They used the word threaten in which tulad nga nung explanation namin kanina, the headlines of CNN, Rappler, and Filter use scare tactics as it uses the word threaten. Ngayon, words like threaten, warning, and the like have negative connotations since they are mostly used in a negative context. With this, the negative tone of the language they use may actually affect the perception of the audience with the subject matter, where in this case, it's President Rodrigo Duterte. As compared kanina, yung present, yung sa ABS-CBN and sa GMA, it actually used lighter tone, if you will notice. And yun po yung that's how we differentiate the bias in the headlines po.
Okay. So may ginawa ba kayong set of adjectives na masasabi niyong unfair? Or verb pala. Verb pala. Sorry. Verb. English. Okay. Paano niyo nasabing yung threaten ay mas ano siya? Mas malala siya dun sa, pati yun nung nauna.
So yun, sir. Yung sa, as you can see, yung sa GMA, it used lighter tone. And it's basically the main idea of the news article. Well, yung kanina po, yun din naman. But yun na nga, I think, actually the use of, yun nga, the scare tactic, yung word na threaten, which has a negative connotation, yun nga, affects the tone of the language, wherein yung tone of the language that we use or the journalists use may affect yung perception ng audience. Yun nga. And then, pero as compared naman dito sa GMA and ABS-CBN, yung sa GMA, yun, they use lighter tone. Basically, they didn't use words like threaten, warning, yung mga words that has a negative connotation. And then yung sa ABS-CBN, it's basically the gist nga nung article. Kasi, and we cannot really say that it's biased because it's basically what the article is all about. It's basically what the content of the article just put into in a short and concise manner. And this get vaccinated or I'll send you to jail is what Duterte has mentioned in his speech. Yun po.
Okay, sige. Okay na yun, sagot na yun. Ang point ko kasi mas nakakatakot sa akin tong fair kaysa dun sa kanina. Okay. Mas unfair sa akin tong nauna, tong ABS. Tsaka tapos yung sa kabila, mas fair sa akin yung wording na ganun. Okay, so avoid this, no? Napansin niyo guys na pag gumamit ka na ng ganitong words, may bias ka na rin as a reporter, as a presenter. Okay? Galing, di ba? Nagre-report kayo about bias. Tapos naging medyo bias din kayo. may ano. Okay lang kasi yung okay, sinabihan nyo siyang unbiased, bias. Kasi ang bias and unbiased, polarity lang yan. Okay, wala silang middle ground. Yung fairness, however, and unfair, wala silang metric. Hindi sila polar lang na two conditions lang. Fair and unfair. Merong nasa gitna. Merong mas fair and mas unfair. Okay? Okay. Sige. Thank you, group 3. Okay. Now, si group 2. Tatanong ako sa group. Ay, group 5 pala. Sorry. Group 5. Sila Gab. Meron kayong slide na may okay, hindi ko maalala kung ano yung slide. Tatanong ko na lang yung tanong ko. Is there a completely objective topic? Kasi meron kayong nilagay na slide na may objective topic something. Pa-flash nga yun para maalala ng iba.
Sige, Junea, pa-flash please nung
Yung may objective.
PowerPoint.
Okay.
Wait lang, sir.
Ayan. Okay, so is there a completely objective topic?
Well, sir, ironically, if we're gonna be objective about that question, there's not completely objective, diba? Pero yung point that we were trying to make with this slide was yung sir, um, yung mga data that there is no subjective connotation to it. Like, for example, we're going to present kung sino yung best or largest exporter ng coffee. So we have objective data to back that up kung sino yung country na may pinakamaraming coffee na na-export, and there is sustainable data to present that. So it is completely objective in the sense that the data presented, hindi mo siya pwede ma-present in a subjective way. Hindi, feeling ko Vietnam pinakamalaki kasi ganito kasi, 'di ba? So there's no like ruling or there's no ground to present it subjectively because the data says otherwise. Yun. So ganun sir. Kaya yung na-present kanina was yung na-mention ko na data was, for example, certain parts of human rights that is agreed upon but universally. So yun nga na universally people agree on this based on the code of ethics. So there's no room for subjective presentation kasi nga it's been agreed upon universally. So yun, parang ganun sir. Pag yung data is completely objective, the topic that is assigned with that data is also completely objective, then there's no room for bias for that kasi it's data being presented.
Okay.
Factual.
Galing. Sagot. Okay, thank you. Agree ako dun, no, na may mga completely objective topic tayo, guys. Pero, buti ayun yung nilagay nilang wording. Kasi if iba yung wording nila, baka hindi na. Okay, kasi in our world na meron tayong free will, walang objective, truly objective. No? So, pero may mga completely objective topic. Kuwari, lumindol, di ba? Siyempre kung gaano kalakas mo lagi yung lindol, may scale talaga dun, di ba? Okay, so kung gaano kalakas yung ulan, di ba? May tayo dun, meron tayong walang room for bias. Very good. Sa group 2, okay na, thank you pala group 5. Sa group 2, patingin ako ng slides nyo. Sige, dun tayo sa may mga source number. Source number 1, source number 2. Yan. Okay, ano yung source number 1? Patingin na ako ng yung file na yan. Sorry. Or kung yung website. Hello, nawala yung sinishare niyo, sir.
Sir, wait lang, may captcha. Wait.
Wala, hindi ka raw tao. Kabahan ka na.
Wait lang, i-verify ko lang po na tao ako.
Kahit yung title lang, gusto ko lang makita yung title na. Para... Ay, nag-ano ka. Alam ko na kung bakit ka nagkakapatcha. Ikaw Okay, sana yun na lang nilagay nyo kaysa source number 1, no? Diba? Para, ano yung sino yung author? Okay. Ito rin ba, okay, sa group 4, Dito nyo rin ba kinuha yung table of results nyo? Is this the same paper? Sa group 4? Sino ba sa group 4? Okay, so yung next group dito, same ano lang din, same paper yung kinuha mo. Okay, sige. Sige, okay na, stop share mo na. Group number 1, meron ba kayong stand kung ano yung is the media bias? Sorry, ang bilis kasi ng mga bagay-bagay sa group 1.
Yes po, sir.
Anong stand niyo?
Our stand is the media is biased po.
Okay. Sige. Okay, so okay, consensus. Okay, so wala naman na akong tanong. Well, may mga comments, general comments ako. Okay? General comments na lang, so time na tayo. Okay, avoid sa mga presentation nyo in your future presentations. Avoid using sentences in your slides. Okay? Kasi nakakapagod sila basahin. Less words, okay? Less words, tas bigger font. Okay. Kung gusto nyo talaga gamitin yung quote, syempre hindi mo naman pwede bawasan yung quote ng isang quote, di ba? So, pwede nyo silang i-blast sa buong screen nyo. Tulad sila Gab, di ba nagbablast sila ng isang phrase lang sa buong isang slide. Very good yung ganun. Meron ding ibang group na may mga ganung slides. Okay, so pero ayan, in general, avoid yung mga sentence na babasahin nyo lang din naman. Okay? Okay. Sa transitions from slides, avoid it kung sa tingin mo hindi kaya ng internet at kung wala kang SSD, yung hard drive mo. Okay? Kasi minsan, laggy siya. Hindi siya nag-show ng maayos for other people na nanonood. Okay? And then, of course, chill lang tayo sa magpe-present. Huwag masyadong kabahan. Kuwari, medyo maingay sa background mo. Huwag kang kabahan. Ganun, guys. Si Minerva parang kinabahan kanina. Parang naiingayan siya sa mga tao sa likod. Kaya pa ba, Minerva? Ayan, medyo kinabahan siya nung ano. Okay, guys. So, chill lang tayo. Walang nag-taglish ka bigla. Okay lang yan. Unless na lang nasa Com 2, ganun, Com 3. Com 2, Com 3, di ba kailangan nyo doon? Extemporaneous speech. Yung mga ganong speech, di ba? Siyempre kailangan mo talaga mag-English doon. Pero sa mga ganitong bagay, feel ko naman in general, carry lang na kung saan kayo komportable. And as always, pag nagre-report kayo, parang chika lang dapat. Chika, marites, ganyan. Okay, chill lang kayo. Nagchichika lang kayo ng facts, di ba? Okay. So, ayan, na-appreciate ko lahat nung gawa nyo. Ang gaganda ng mga slides nyo. Dun sa module assignment na for this, i-open ko for submission. Ang gagawin nyo lang, isasubmit nyo yung pinresent nyo yung slides, okay? PDF or pictures na hindi ko alam kung saan kayo nagpe-present, sa Canva ba? O pwede ata i-export yan, no? Okay, so again, congratulations everyone. Ang gaganda ng works nyo. Tuloy nyo yan in your future years, no? Kung may energy pa kayo. Okay? Ang effort nyo with slides. Samantalang kami mga physics majors, pag nag-slides kami, white screen, text, ganun lang. Napalitan ba namin titles or as listener? Sino to nagtatanong ng papalitan yung titles? Sorry. Anong group
Pero
kayo?
yung kanina, yung may source, sabi niyo po.
Yung source number.
Opo.
Okay, as is lang yung i-upload nyo, as is kung ano yung
Sige po, sir.
present nyo lang. Okay?
Okay po. Thank you.
Okay. So lahat
Sir,
naman, yes.
isa lang po ba mag-a-upload?
Yung group leader lang. Group leader lang.
Sige po.
Okay. Galing. So lahat magaling mag-report. Guys, galing. Okay? First year pa lang yan, partida. Okay. So, okay, end na tayo. Dahil lagpas na tayo sa time. Thank you very much, everyone. May sasagutan din kayong peer evaluation. Yes, may sasagutan kayo. Hindi ko pa nagagawa pero gagawin ko sometime. So next week, ibibigay ko na yung final pitch nyo. Next meeting, Thursday. Mabilis lang yung natin sa Thursday, parang 30 minutes lang. Bali, ipapresent ko lang yung topic nyo for the final pitch. And then, yung rubrics lang, kung paano yung grading. Okay? May last comment pa pala ako. No? Kung nag-research, nagtingin-tingin kayo sa internet, di ba? Pinakamababang yung Manila Times. Nakakabwisit magbasa dun. No? Sobrang bias, nakakabwisit siyang basahin. Nagbasa kayo ng ibang nila. Ibang articles nila. Ano ba itong wala lang. Chika lang. Natatawa lang ako. Okay. Sige, Mark. Nakataas ka ng kamay. Sorry.
Sir, confirm ko lang po, after po ba ng session natin, yung consultation regarding the case study?
Tuloy tayo sa consultation.
Okay po.
Grabe si Gab. Masaya po magbasa ng Bulgar. Wala na naglalako ng Bulgar sa Kalyon. Sa sa palengke na lang sa mga TV. Ayan, masaya magbasa ng Bulgar kasi parang marites lang yung gumawa ng headline. Okay lang yan. Hindi naman yung bastos tinutukoy ko. Kasi may mga titles sila, article titles sila na walang sense. Talagang for the clickbait siya. Di ba? Mga ganyang title. Ano ba naman to? Parang wala kang info makukuha dun sa article. Okay, so sige. Stop